Something extraordinary happened recently that most Americans completely missed. The United States government, the same institution that spent decades championing free markets and warning the world about the dangers of state capitalism, quietly became an investor in the American stock market. Not through some nationalization scheme or socialist revolution, but through a series of carefully structured deals that gave Washington ownership stakes in some of the most strategically vital companies in the nation. Intel, the semiconductor giant that powers everything from laptops to military systems. MP Materials, the only rare earth mining operation on American soil. Lithium Americas, controlling one of North America's largest lithium deposits.
U.S. Steel, where the government now holds what's called a golden share, giving it veto power over major corporate decisions. These aren't small investments or temporary bailouts. These are permanent ownership positions in the commanding heights of the American economy. The official story is national security, making sure America can produce its own chips, mine its own rare earths, refine its own lithium, and manufacture its own steel without depending on China or anyone else. But strip away the rhetoric, and what you're witnessing is a fundamental transformation in how American capitalism operates. The government isn't just regulating these industries anymore. It's not just subsidizing them. It's owning them. And that changes everything. This isn't the first time a government has taken equity stakes in private companies during a crisis, but it might be the first time America has done it during peacetime. Not as an emergency measure, but as a deliberate economic strategy. And the implications stretch far beyond a few stock certificates sitting in a Treasury Department vault. Because when the government becomes an investor, it stops being a neutral referee. It becomes a player. And players don't just enforce the rules, they bend them to win. To understand how we got here, you need to understand what's been happening beneath the surface of global economics for the past 2 decades. The world has been splitting into 2 competing systems of how to organize an economy. On one side, the American model, built on free markets, private ownership, and the belief that competition drives innovation. On the other side, the Chinese model, built on state capitalism, where the government owns or controls key industries and uses that power to steer the entire economy toward strategic goals. For years, American policymakers insisted their model was superior. Free markets are more efficient, they said. Private companies innovate faster than state-owned enterprises. Competition produces better products at lower prices. And they weren't entirely wrong. American tech companies did dominate the internet. American pharmaceutical companies did lead in drug development. American financial institutions did control global capital flows. The proof, they argued, was in the results. But then China started winning. Not by playing America's game, but by playing its own. China didn't wait for private companies to decide rare earth mining was profitable. The government identified it as strategically important and poured resources into dominating the entire supply chain. China didn't leave solar panel production to market forces. It subsidized manufacturers until Chinese companies controlled 80% of global production. China didn't hope its electric vehicle makers could compete. It funded them, protected them, and gave them access to cheap resources until they could produce cars that were better and cheaper than anything coming out of Detroit. And here's what American policymakers slowly realized. You cannot beat a command economy using free market principles. When your competitor's government is willing to lose money for a decade to capture a strategic industry, your private companies can't compete. When your opponent subsidizes manufacturing to the point where production costs become irrelevant, your businesses go bankrupt. When capital flows not toward the highest return, but toward national priorities, financial markets stop mattering. The breaking point came with semiconductors. For decades, America designed the world's most advanced chips. But the actual manufacturing moved overseas, mostly to Taiwan, because building fabs was expensive and Asian governments offered better incentives. This worked fine until geopolitics made it a liability. Taiwan sits 90 miles from mainland China, in one of the world's most volatile flashpoints. If China ever invaded, or even blockaded the island, America's entire tech sector would collapse overnight. The Pentagon couldn't get chips for weapons systems. Apple couldn't get processors for iPhones. The automotive industry couldn't get the components that make modern cars function. And China knew this. Beijing had spent years building its own semiconductor capabilities, not because Chinese companies were more innovative, but because the government decided chip independence was a national priority and funded it accordingly. By now, China is still behind the cutting edge, but it's catching up fast. And more importantly, it controls most of the raw materials and manufacturing equipment needed to make advanced chips. If America wanted to rebuild its semiconductor industry, it needed resources China dominated. That's where rare earths enter the picture. These 17 metallic elements, with names most people can't pronounce, are essential to modern technology. They're in your smartphone, your laptop, electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, military guidance systems, and advanced weaponry. And China controls roughly 90% of global rare earth refining. Not mining, refining. The actual process of turning ore into usable materials. Other countries have rare earth deposits. Australia, Canada, the United States all have them. But China spent decades building the infrastructure to process them cheaply and efficiently, often at a loss, until everyone else gave up trying to compete. When the United States announced it wanted to rebuild domestic chip production through the CHIPS and Science Act, China quietly reminded the world who controlled the supply chain. Rare earth export restrictions tightened, prices fluctuated, and American policymakers realized they had a problem. You can't build a domestic semiconductor industry if you're dependent on your strategic rival for the materials to make the chips. The same pattern repeated across critical industries. Lithium, essential for batteries in electric vehicles and energy storage. China controls 70% of global lithium refining, even though most lithium is mined elsewhere. Solar panels, crucial for renewable energy. China produces 80% of the world's supply. Steel, still the backbone of infrastructure and defense. China produces more steel annually than the rest of the world combined. In each case, the dynamic was identical. America had abandoned manufacturing in these sectors because the free market said they weren't profitable enough. China had subsidized them regardless because the government decided they were strategically important. And now, decades later, America was dependent on China for the inputs to almost every critical technology. So Washington faced a choice. It could continue preaching free market principles while watching China dominate the industries of the future, or it could adopt the same playbook China had been using for 20 years. Use government money, government loans, and government leverage to rebuild strategic industries on American soil, even if the economics didn't make sense in the short term. They chose the latter. But they couldn't just hand out cash. Congress would never approve trillions in direct subsidies with no strings attached. And politically, it would look like corporate welfare, which neither party wanted to defend. So they came up with something more subtle. Instead of grants, they offered loans. Instead of subsidies, they negotiated equity stakes. Instead of nationalizing companies, they became shareholders. The mechanics varied by company, but the pattern was consistent. Take Intel. The company was struggling. It had lost its manufacturing edge to Taiwan Semiconductor. Its stock price had collapsed, and it needed billions to build new fabrication plants in America. Under the CHIPS Act, Intel qualified for federal funding. But instead of just handing over the money, the Treasury and Commerce departments restructured the deal. They converted part of the funding into equity, giving the government roughly 10% ownership of Intel, plus the option to buy more if the company hit certain production targets. For Intel, this was better than a loan. Equity doesn't have to be repaid. It doesn't carry interest, and it came with political protection. If Intel struggled, the government now had a vested interest in helping it succeed. For Washington, it was a way to ensure taxpayer money wasn't wasted. If Intel's stock price rose, the government's stake became more valuable, and critically, it gave Washington influence over Intel's strategic decisions.
MP Materials followed a similar path. The company operates the only rare earth mine in America, in Mountain Pass, California. But mining rare earths is only half the battle. You also need to refine them, and MP Materials didn't have that capability. Building a refining facility would cost billions, money the company didn't have. The Department of Defense stepped in with funding, but structured as convertible preferred stock. The government got roughly 15% ownership, plus influence over pricing and export rules. Translation? MP Materials couldn't just sell refined rare earths to the highest bidder, which might be China. Washington now had a say in where those materials went. Lithium Americas presented a different situation. The company had secured rights to a massive lithium deposit in Nevada, potentially one of the largest in North America. But developing a mine from scratch requires enormous capital, and private investors were hesitant. Lithium prices are volatile, environmental regulations are strict, and Chinese competitors could flood the market to drive prices down before the mine became profitable. The Department of Energy offered a $2.3 billion loan to get the project moving. But buried in the terms was a clause giving the government stock warrants, the right to purchase up to 10% of the company if the mine succeeded. Again, not a bailout, not charity, ownership. Then there's U.S. Steel. When Nippon Steel, a Japanese company, announced plans to acquire the American steelmaker, the deal looked straightforward. Japanese companies had bought American assets before. Japan is a close ally. What could be controversial? But the White House intervened. The administration declared that U.S. Steel must remain under American control, not because Japan was hostile, but because steel is classified as a strategic resource. The Pentagon needs it for ships, tanks, and infrastructure. And letting a foreign company control a major American steel producer, even a friendly one, created a dependency Washington no longer wanted. The solution was the golden share. Nippon Steel could proceed with the acquisition, but only if the U.S. government received a special share that gave it veto power over major corporate decisions. Plant closures, foreign sales of American steel, executive appointments that might shift the company's strategic direction. Anything that could threaten national security interests. The government wouldn't own a large percentage of the company, but it would own the most powerful share. Across all these deals, the pattern is the same. The government identifies a strategic vulnerability. It offers funding that private won't provide, and in exchange, it takes an ownership position that gives it influence over how the company operates. This isn't nationalization. The companies remain publicly traded. Private shareholders still exist. Management still runs day-to-day operations. But the government is now at the table, and its interests don't always align with maximizing shareholder returns. And here's where the American experiment diverges on ideology. For decades, the United States lectured the world about the dangers of state capitalism. When China took ownership stakes in strategic companies, Washington called it manipulation. When Chinese state-owned enterprises received preferential treatment, America filed complaints with the World Trade Organization. When Beijing used subsidies to help its company undercut foreign competitors, U.S. officials labeled it unfair trade and imposed tariffs. The criticism wasn't entirely unfounded. China's model does distort markets. State-owned enterprises do get advantages private companies don't. And government influence does sometimes stifle innovation because politically connected firms can survive without being efficient. American policymakers pointed to all of this as proof that free markets were superior. But now America is adopting a version of the same model. Not because policymakers suddenly decided state capitalism was better, but because the alternative, letting China dominate every strategic industry while America clung to free market principles, was no longer tenable. The world changed. China proved that a command economy could compete with, and in some areas surpass, a market economy, and America had to adapt, or accept decline. The question is whether this adaptation strengthens America or weakens it. And the answer depends entirely on how the government uses its new power. There's a case to be made that this is good policy. Strategic industries like semiconductors,
rare earths, and advanced manufacturing are too important to leave entirely to market forces. If private capital won't invest because the returns are uncertain or the timeline's too long, government capital can fill the gap. And taking equity stakes ensures taxpayers get something back if the investments succeed. It's not a handout, it's a partnership. Moreover, China's rise has exposed a flaw in pure free market ideology. Markets are efficient at allocating capital toward the highest short-term returns, but they're terrible at accounting for long-term strategic risks. No private company is going to spend billions building a rare earth refinery if Chinese competitors can undercut them on price. But from a national security perspective, that refinery is invaluable. The government's role, then, is to bridge the gap between what markets will fund and what the nation needs. Japan and South Korea followed similar models during their industrial rise. The Japanese government worked closely with companies like Toyota and Sony, providing financing and protection until they could compete globally. South Korea's chaebols, massive conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai, grew with heavy government support. In both cases, state involvement helped create globally competitive industries. There's precedent for this working. But there's also a case that this is dangerous, because once the government becomes an investor, the incentives change. Companies stop competing purely on efficiency and innovation. They start competing for political favor. Why spend billions on research and development when you can spend millions on lobbying to secure government contracts or equity deals? Why take risks on unproven technologies when the safest path to profit is aligning with whatever administration is in power? This is the core problem with state capitalism. It rewards political connections over market performance. In China, this manifests as rent-seeking behavior. Companies exist not to serve customers, but to stay in favor with the Communist Party. They get cheap loans, tax breaks, and regulatory advantages not because they're efficient, but because they're strategically aligned. Independent companies, even innovative ones, struggle because they lack political access. If America goes down this path, the same dynamics could emerge. Companies that secure government equity investments will have advantages competitors don't. Access to capital, regulatory protection, guaranteed markets through defense contracts or infrastructure projects. Over time, this could create a two-tier economy. Politically connected firms that thrive regardless of performance. And everyone else starved for capital and approvals, unable to compete. History suggests this risk is real. The Soviet Union's economy collapsed not because it lacked resources or educated workers, but because political loyalty mattered more than productivity. Companies that produced inferior goods survived because they were connected to the right officials. Innovation stalled because taking risks was politically dangerous. The economy became sclerotic, unable to adapt, eventually crumbling. China has avoided that fate so far by maintaining enough market competition to drive innovation. But even China is showing cracks. Its real estate sector, dominated by state-backed developers, has become a massive financial bubble. Local governments, drowning in debt from infrastructure projects that don't generate returns, are on the verge of insolvency. And youth unemployment is rising because state-owned enterprises can't absorb all the graduates, while private companies struggle to access capital. America could end up in a similar trap. Not overnight, but gradually. Each equity deal sets a precedent. Each government investment creates an expectation that Washington will protect favored companies from failure. And each protected company creates resentment among competitors who don't have the same advantages. Over time, the economy could shift from rewarding innovation to rewarding lobbying. From creative destruction to political preservation. There's another risk that rarely gets discussed. When the government owns stakes in companies, it has a vested interest in their stock prices remaining high. This creates perverse incentives,
especially during election years. If Intel's stock crashes, it reflects poorly on the administration that invested in it. If MP Materials struggles, it undermines the narrative that bringing rare earth production back to America was wise. Politicians will be tempted to prop up these companies even when market forces say they should shrink or fail. This is how you get zombie companies, firms that should have gone bankrupt years ago but survive because government support keeps them alive. Japan experienced this in the 1990s after its asset bubble burst. Banks, heavily influenced by the government, kept lending to insolvent companies to avoid recognizing losses. The result was 2 lost decades of stagnant growth. Resources that should have flowed to productive new companies stayed trapped in dying ones. America could face the same problem. If the government's equity stakes become too politically sensitive to abandon, it will prop up failures instead of letting creative destruction do its work. And that's how economies stagnate. But setting aside the long-term risks, there's a more immediate question. Why is this happening now?
Why is this the moment America decided to become an investor in its own stock market?
The answer is timing. China's economy is slowing. Decades of debt-fueled growth are catching up with Beijing. The real estate bubble is deflating. Demographics are turning negative. And the Communist Party is struggling to transition from an export-led model to a consumption-driven one. For the first time in 40 years, China looks vulnerable. Meanwhile, the United States is facing its own pressures. National debt exceeds $36 trillion. Deficits are structural, not cyclical. And the dollar's reserve currency status, which has allowed America to borrow cheaply for decades, is slowly eroding as other nations seek alternatives. Washington can't afford another decade of letting China capture strategic industries unopposed. At the same time, the global economy is fracturing. The post-Cold War dream of universal free trade and integrated markets is dead. The world is splitting into 2 blocks, one centered around American and European capital, technology, and financial systems, the other centered around Chinese manufacturing, resources, and state-directed investment.
Both sides are racing to secure the same things: energy, microchips, rare earth minerals, artificial intelligence. Whoever controls these inputs controls the economy of the future. In this environment, free market principles become a handicap. If your opponent is willing to subsidize industries at a loss for a decade to capture market share, and you refuse to do the same on principle, you lose. If your rival uses state power to secure resource contracts while your companies negotiate individually, you lose. If their government can direct investment toward strategic priorities while your capital flows toward quarterly returns, you lose. America's policymakers looked at this landscape and realized the old playbook wasn't working. Sanctions couldn't stop China from advancing in semiconductors. Trade deals couldn't bring rare earth refining back to America, and moral arguments about free markets didn't matter if China was winning the industries that would define the next century. So they adapted, not by abandoning capitalism entirely, but by grafting state involvement onto it, taking equity stakes in strategic companies, using government balance sheets to de-risk investments private capital wouldn't touch, and most importantly, accepting that in a world where your main competitor uses state power to achieve economic goals, you can't afford to keep one hand tied behind your back. This is America's bet, that it can adopt elements of state capitalism without succumbing to the inefficiencies that plague command economies. That it can use government investment to rebuild strategic industries without creating the rent-seeking and political favoritism that stifle innovation. That it can compete with China on China's terms, while maintaining enough market discipline to stay dynamic. It's not an impossible bet, but it's a difficult one, because state capitalism is a game of nuance and restraint. You need enough government involvement to direct resources toward strategic priorities, but not so much that political considerations override economic reality. You need protection for infant industries, but not permanent subsidies that prevent them from ever growing up. You need coordination between government and business, but not collusion that excludes competition. Few countries have managed this balance successfully for long. Japan did in the 1960s and 70s, then lost it in the 1990s. South Korea has done better, but even there, the chaebols have become so powerful they distort politics. Singapore might be the best example. A tightly managed economy that maintains market discipline through international competition. But Singapore is a city-state of 6 million people. Scaling that model to a continental nation of 330 million is a different challenge entirely. And there's a deeper question lurking beneath all of this. If America becomes an investor in its own economy, what happens to the idea of America itself? For over 2 centuries, the American identity has been built on the notion of limited government and free enterprise. The idea that individuals and companies, not the state, should drive economic progress. That competition and creative destruction, not central planning, produce prosperity. That government's role is to set rules and enforce them, not pick winners and losers. State capitalism undermines all of that, not through revolution or ideology, but through incremental necessity. Each equity stake is justified by strategic imperatives. Each intervention is framed as temporary or exceptional. But the cumulative effect is a fundamental transformation. America becomes less a nation of entrepreneurs competing in open markets and more a nation of stakeholders negotiating with a government that owns pieces of the commanding heights. This matters beyond economics because how a society organizes its economy shapes how it organizes everything else. Free markets tend to correlate with political pluralism because economic power is dispersed. State capitalism tends to concentrate power because the same institutions that control capital also control opportunity. The more the government owns, the more it can reward loyalty and punish dissent, not through overt repression, but through the subtle levers of contracts, loans, and approvals. China demonstrates this clearly. The Communist Party doesn't need to arrest every critic. It just denies them access to the financial system. No bank loans, no investment capital, no business licenses. In a state capitalist system, economic exclusion becomes political control. And while America is nowhere near that level of state involvement, the direction of travel should give pause. Because once government owns stakes in strategic industries, it gains power to shape not just what gets built, but who gets to build it. For investors, this new landscape creates both risks and opportunities. On one hand, companies with government backing have a safety net others don't. If Intel struggles, Washington has a vested interest in helping it recover. If lithium prices collapse, the government might step in to stabilize Lithium Americas. This creates a floor under certain stocks, reducing downside risk. It's not quite too big to fail, but it's similar. Government ownership implies government support. This could drive capital toward politically favored companies regardless of their fundamentals. If Wall Street believes Washington will prop up its equity investments, those stocks become safer bets. And in a low-return environment where yield is scarce, even a modest government backstop can attract billions in private capital. We saw this with government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac before 2008. Investors assumed the government wouldn't let them fail. They were mostly right, even after the crisis. On the other hand, government ownership introduces political risk that didn't exist before. What happens when a new administration takes power and decides previous equity deals were bad policy? What if a populist movement demands the government sell its stakes or use its ownership to force companies to prioritize jobs over profits? Corporate strategy becomes subject to political whims in ways private companies have never experienced. Also the question of what this means for capital allocation across the broader economy. If government-backed companies have advantages, capital flows toward them and away from competitors, even if those competitors are more innovative or efficient. Over time, this could hollow out sectors of the economy that aren't deemed strategically important. Why invest in consumer goods or services when all the government money is flowing towards semiconductors and rare earths? Market distortion, once it starts, tends to cascade. And then there's the wild card of artificial intelligence. The same technology that's automating jobs and replacing human workers is also being integrated into investment decisions. AI-driven funds already manage trillions in assets, making trades based on algorithms that optimize for returns. But what happens when those algorithms have to account for government ownership? Do they weigh political risk differently? Do they favor companies with state backing because the downside is limited? More provocatively, what happens when AI itself starts advising investors to move capital out of politically unstable systems? If an algorithm determines that state capitalism in America is creating the same inefficiencies it created elsewhere, it might recommend diversification into assets the government can't manipulate. Decentralized systems, cross-border holdings, anything outside the reach of state influence. This brings us to a final, uncomfortable reality. The government's move into equity ownership isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern where every major economic actor, governments, central banks, corporations, is trying to secure control over scarce resources in a world that's becoming less predictable. Climate change is making agriculture and water unpredictable. Geopolitical tensions are fracturing supply chains. And technological change is accelerating faster than institutions can adapt. In this environment, those who own the input, energy, minerals, food production, data infrastructure, have power that transcends traditional measures of wealth. And governments, recognizing this, are racing to secure ownership or control before it's too late. America's equity stakes in semiconductor and mining companies aren't just about jobs or innovation. They're about ensuring access to resources that might be weaponized in future conflicts, economic or military. So where does this leave the average person? For most Americans, the government's transformation into an investor will be invisible. Your life won't change because Washington owns 10% of Intel. Your grocery bill won't drop because the government has a stake in lithium mining. But over time, the economy will function differently. Capital will flow toward politically favored industry. Jobs will concentrate in sectors the government deems strategic. And success will depend increasingly on proximity to power, not just talent or effort. For those paying attention, this is the moment to recognize that the rules are changing. The economy you grew up in, where private capital and market forces determined winners and losers, is giving way to something different. Not socialism, not pure capitalism, something hybrid and harder to categorize. An economy where the government is both referee and player, regulator and investor, protector and competitor. The question isn't whether this is good or bad. The question is whether America can manage the contradictions inherent in this system. Can it use government capital to rebuild strategic industries without creating the dependency and inefficiency that plague command economies? Can it maintain market discipline while pursuing national priorities that markets won't fund? Can it prevent political favoritism from replacing competition as the driver of success? No one knows yet. Because America has never tried this before, not at this scale, not in peace, not as a deliberate strategy rather than a crisis response, we're in uncharted territory. And history suggests that when nations blur the line between state and market, the outcome rarely what planners intended. What is certain is this: the government is no longer just setting the rules of the game. It's playing. And once that happens, everyone else has to adjust their strategy accordingly, because in a market where the government is your competitor, your customer, and your investor all at once, the old assumptions about how capitalism works no longer apply. The silent takeover isn't coming, it's already here. And whether it leads to a renaissance of American manufacturing or the slow decline into inefficiency that has plagued every state capitalist experiment before it will depend on choices made in the coming years. Choices most people won't even realize are being made until it's far too late to change course. History has the answers. We just have to decide whether we're willing to learn from it.